everyone, today we're back with a new boss guide. This is the single best Uber Eldritch boss killer that your money can buy. This, for around 11 Exalted, will get you more kills per minute than a multi-mirror build can, and there is absolutely nothing that can come anywhere close to the strength of this build. This build's really cheap to put together. It just needs a few common uniques that you never really thought about putting together, but it makes for an extremely strong build when you do. This is also probably the most fun I've ever had killing a boss. Walking up to it and one-shotting it with Cast on Death Discharge is the most satisfying thing I've experienced in the game in a while. First, let's start off by talking about our character and the gear that we're going to be using for this. We are doing all of this as an occultist. There are two ascendancies that this works for. You can either do it as occultist or assassin, but we have found through quite a lot of testing and quite a lot of path of building that occultist simply will excel more than assassin can, and most of the things that assassin brings to the table really aren't very useful until much later in terms of your budget. The only thing that assassin has over occultist in terms of putting this build together would be getting Swift Killer with Forbidden Flesh and Forbidden Flame. But the total power of Swift Killer versus playing occultist and getting Heart of Destruction isn't big enough to really warrant playing assassin. You'll also have an easier time as occultist with lower budget. As for the gear, we're mostly just putting on a bunch of really cheap 1C uniques. A lot of this is possible because of Annihilating Light. Dealing triple damage with elemental skills, it's what's letting us scale into the billions. It's what is allowing us to one-shot bosses. We also have two Call the Brotherhoods. This is allowing us to cold converts, which allows us to abuse hatred with a divine blessing, gain a substantial boost in damage. Important thing about the calls of the Brotherhood is we want to make sure they are dusted with elemental damage, as that lets the conversion go from 40% to 48%. So this 98% converts our damage over to cold. We're also using a badge of the Brotherhood. This gives us maximum frenzy charges equivalent to our maximum power charges, which allows us to scale very quickly off of both. Discharge gains a lot of flat damage per charge, and we really want to get a lot of lightning, a lot of cold, especially since we're converting all the lightning damage into cold. We're going to have a massive cold hit with all of this. Frenzy charges also give us 4% more damage per frenzy charge, which on top of them just straight up giving us a lot of free flat damage when discharge goes off, it's also amping our damage more. For the helmets, we're using the biggest meme helmets in the game, but this helmet ends up actually fitting every criteria that this build needs. We're using a Broken Crown, which gives us level 20 Cast on Death. This actually saves us a gem, which allows us to min-max this build a bit more with more investment. Also gives us attributes. We need the attributes. We actually struggle to hit our strength and dex requirements, especially if we want to change our tree around. We have to path through a lot of dex to make the build work until we get more dex from other sources. Gives us a bit of damage on low life. And most importantly, it gives us a very hefty chunk of chaos resistance, as chaos resistance is kind of crucial for this build to make our combo at the end work. For gloves, we're using Surge Binders. These simply just give us damage per charge, and there is nothing else that would give us more damage in the slot. For belts, we're using a String of Servitude with 75% crit multi, but you can also run a Darkness Enthralled with 2 jewels in it that give penetration if you haven't killed recently and crit multi. This is only ever so slightly worse than a String of Servitude, but if you can get a crit multi String of Servitude, this is much better. And for the boot slots, we're simply putting on Fugitive Boots that have been rolled with a chaos resistance essence and with extra dexterity on them. Chaos resistance is very important in this build to make our flasks, deodries, elixirs work correctly. When we press deodries, it's going to deal 50% of our maximum life as chaos damage. We need to have enough chaos resistance to where the first 3 flasks don't kill us, but the 4th one kills us. If we have 0 chaos resistance, we're going to die on the 2nd, and it's going to make our combo not work. Talk more about that later though. For now, let's go over to Path of Building and look at some more stuff there. So this is the Path of Building that we'll be using for this build. We had a challenge to put this together for as cheap as possible, and we ended up doing this for 11 Exalted. With the gear that is in here, we were able to one-shot both Uber Searing Exarch and Uber Eater of Worlds by just simply walking up to them. To level a witch or an assassin, if you don't have one around level 90, you can level this with Hollow Palm and then respec over once you're done. You could also buy a 5-ray carry for 3 Exalted once you finish the axe, and it should be enough XP to get to about level 90. Don't recommend doing this with a lower level than that. You'll be missing out on too much power. Including the path building as well as a set of notes on what I think is probably the best upgrade order if you would like to go past 11 Exalted and gain a bit more damage. The only important thing with this build is having an average hit of at least 190 million. If we go to the config, we can see that we put a 70% less damage custom modifier on here. If we were to take this off, we're at 1.3 billion damage average hit, but that's not very realistic for Uber bosses as they have a 70% less damage mod. To simulate that, we just put in a custom modifier, and then we can see our true damage against Uber bosses. The nice thing about having a bigger average hit than what is required to one-shot a Uber boss is that you could do other map mods. So for example, if you had 500 million average hit, for example, you can do every monster life increase, or you could maybe do elemental resistances or suppress. The nice thing about that is you can roll your maps for higher quantity, which allows you to profit more from the Eldritch currency that also drops sometimes with the boss. The last thing to note about this is the megalomaniac that was used for this build. In the description, there will be a link for better trading that you can import to have every single item that you would need to start this build. There's also a search for the megalomaniac, and this is filtered for all of the passives on it that are a decent increase. You're not going to be able to find one exactly like the one that is used in Path of Building, but you should be able to find one that is relatively as strong, if not stronger. I would leave it as a count of 2. Count 3 of all this is basically unobtainable. They're extremely rare, but there's plenty of count 2s that are just as strong. I would simply look at the ones that are here, copy them, bring them into Path of Building, and import them in here and compare them to this megalomaniac to see if it's stronger or weaker, and purchase one based on that knowledge. Last thing to mention, with the Bottled Faith, make sure you enkindling orbit for increased effects. We're only going to get to press the button once per kill, and we really want the button to be as strong as possible. In terms of the Bottled Faith that you get, the only roll that you care about on it is the Consecrated Ground created during effect applies 10% increased damage to enemies. You ideally want 10%. The critical strike chance does not do anything for us because Anomalous cast on death is going to put us at 100% crit chance. So we only want the increased damage. As for the Pantheon that we'd want for this build, we want to take Arakali as our major, and we want to take Abarath as our minor. Abarath is mostly for the unaffected by Burning Ground. That just means if we ever roll that on our invitations, we don't need to re-roll over it, and it just effectively becomes a free quant roll. Arakali is simply here for the 10% reduced damage taken over time. We are not immune to Desecrated Ground, so this helps reduce that damage a bit while we wait for the boss to spawn. And this also helps with Righteous Fire. This gives us a slight increase in time that we have to snapshot it into our death before we hit 1 health and RF gets turned off. Let's also talk about the gems that we want for this. The first thing is our curses. We're going to be running Assassin's Mark, Frostbite, Elemental Weakness. These are going to go with a cast on death into our weapon. This has to be in your weapon, so it will trigger before everything else happens. There's an order of operations to how cast on death works, going staff, helmet, chest plate, gloves, boots. So if we put our curses in our staff, that means they will be triggered and on the boss before our discharge goes off. You can also add an enhance to this. This is only important for elemental weakness and for anomalous assassin's mark. If you don't have both of these, the enhance isn't needed, and this can simply just be a 4-link. In our helmets, we are going to be putting a culling strike and a firestorm. This is simply there to help us just in case we don't do enough damage to kill the boss. If they happen to be within culling strike range, firestorm will finish off. The nice thing about our helmet is that we have cast on death built into it, so we don't need to use a support there. If you end up getting a broken crown with +1 power charges and plus AoE or plus aura, you could also put your skitter bots and your zealotry in there to get a bit more damage. For our other aura, we're going to be running hatred with divine blessing. This is simply going to give us a double damage boost, and we press this at the start of our combo once we're ready to kill a boss. I'm also running phase run with arcane surge. Phase run needs to be at least level 16 to use enough mana to proc a level 1 arcane surge. This is just more free damage. There's no reason we shouldn't include this. You don't need an anomalous phase run. This is simply the cheapest option. This build can't really level things. We can't go out in the world and get XP. So I simply just bought a high level phase run and de-leveled it down to level 16. We're also going to be using a cast when damage taken with a righteous fire and a wave of conviction. The cast when damage taken specifically has to be level 6 and the righteous fire has to be level 10. This is the highest level of Righteous Fire that we can use with this build before we run into problems with snapshotting. A core concept of this build is going to be the Deodri's Elixirs. Each one of these, when we press them, is going to give us charges, but also damage us. The way we have everything set up with our Chaos Resistance is the third flask will almost kill us, but not quite. And then if we were to press the fourth flask, if we weren't in our hideout, it would kill us and that would trigger everything. So we don't need to wait for the enemy to hit us. The important part here is on the third flask as well. If we put these in here, it is just enough damage since these do hit us to trigger a Righteous Fire. If we press 2, 3, 4, RF gets turned on, but only for a brief second. What's important here is it still gets turned on. So then we can press our fourth flask and that will instantly kill us. But since RF will still be on, we won't be hitting 1 health by that point. It will snapshot the 29% more spell damage into our discharge. As after some extensive looking, every single effect that is currently on you when you die is applied to discharge. You might have to play around with this based on your level and based on the life and ES rolls on your gear. 6, 10 seems to be the sweet spot, but you might have to go down to 5, 9 or 5, 8. So give it a go in Blood Aqueducts. Just turn on 3 flasks, look at your buffs and see if for a split second you have an ignite buff or if you see the RF effect around you. If not, de-level it a bit more and it should work just fine. Also putting a Wave of Conviction in there. As long as we're standing next to the boss, this will hit it before everything else happens and we just get free exposure from that. For a movement skill, you can use whatever you'd like. I prefer Flame Dash. It feels a bit better, especially on Searing Exarch, if I need to dash over one of the little flame runes if we don't get a clean one-shot. And for our 6th link, we are going to be using Discharge, Elemental Focus, Concentrate Effect, Empower, Control Destruction, and Anomalous Cast on Death. The only things that are important here is Anomalous Cast on Death. This build simply does not work without this. This gives us 100% 2 critical strike chance. This isn't increased, this is 2. Effectively, that means our discharge with a 7% base crit chance has a 107% base crit chance. This allows us to also run Control Destruction. And while it does reduce our crit chance by quite a bit, we still will have a 20% base crit chance, which with a few power charges puts us back up to 100%. The only other important gem, if you're starting this on a budget, is Awakened Elemental Focus. You can either get a level 3, a level 4, or a level 5 version of this. It does not matter, as the +2 socketed gems from Skin of the Lords will still bring to level 5. And at level 5, this gives us +1 supported elemental skill gems, which is a massive damage increase. Pick this up for like 2 exalted and is highly worth buying. The Phantasmal Discharge, while extremely expensive, would be a slight DPS increase. It is absolutely not needed, and all of the testing I've done with this build was with a level 20 0 quality discharge and it worked just fine. The same thing goes for an Empower. You do not need a level 4 Empower to start, but I would say to at minimum get a level 3. You could work this with level 2 if you're on a super tight budget, but I don't recommend it. Let's go over the mechanics of this build one more time in case you missed in the gem section. The most important part is that our curses are in our weapon with the cast when damage taken. This causes them to trigger before the discharge happens, and it's the only way we can reliably curse enemies. We're also running a level 6 cast when damage taken with a level 10 Righteous Fire. The important thing here is that the cast when damage taken is triggering on the 3rd flask, so we can have the RF happen before we hit the 4th flask. These flasks are how we're going to get all the charges that we need for our discharge. When you buy flasks, I would recommend to get whatever frenzy and power charge rolls you can that fill your charges by the 3rd. If I hit my first 3, as you can see, I'm at 8, 3, 8, which is my current cap. And then the 4th one will kill me. It does not matter how many charges the 4th one gives me, as long as I'm at my max on the 3rd. The 4th one is simply there to be a kill button. This way, I don't have to wait for the boss to hit me. And this way, I can snapshot an RF into the damage. To give an example here, I'm gonna quickly suicide a few times, and if you look at my buffs, you can see what I mean. When we're dying, for a split second, you can see that RF is turned on. You can both see it visually around my character, and you can also see the little ignite buff by our power charges. What is happening here is when we're Pressing our first 3 flasks, we are going down to very low health. This is due to our chaos resistance being high enough. If your chaos resistance isn't around 40% or higher, the third one or the second one will kill you, and that will make the cast when damage taken not trigger at the correct time. So with 3 flasks, we are taking 897 damage, and we have about a third of our life left, which is enough time for you to be able to press the 4th flask before the RF brings you down to 1 HP and turns itself off. If we die while the RF is still turned on, we still gain the 29% more spell damage for the discharge, as everything is snapshotted as we die and the damage counts. This snapshotting behavior is also what's allowing us to run Pain Attunement. From our understanding of a lot of testing on Space Mommy, being dead does not necessarily count as low life, but being at low life right before we die does count for snapshotting. If we were to instantaneously die from full health, that also wouldn't count as low life. So we need to be in a state where our health is below 50% in order to benefit from Pain Attunement. So it's very crucial that you pay attention to your chaos resistance and maybe even divine your fugitive boots and bless them to gain as much chaos resistance as possible, but you don't want too much, because too much can make the 4th flask not kill you, and that will ruin the whole combo. Let's actually talk about the build and how it works and how this can one-shot bosses. The combo that we're going to be going for is we are going to turn all of our auras on. We are then going to press Bottled Faith and then press all 4 of our Deodre's elixirs. It's very simple. When we walk up to a boss, we first need to wait a few seconds. The higher budget that your build is and the more damage it does, the shorter of a period you have to wait. All bosses, when they spawn, have a natural damage reduction applied onto them that fades over a few seconds. Normal bosses have a 90% damage reduction that fades over 4 to 5 seconds, and Uber bosses have a 99% damage reduction that fades over 8 seconds. Depending on how much damage you do will depend on how long you have to wait. The easiest thing to do is to simply run around in a circle. Neither of the bosses do anything scary. Eater Worlds just simply does tentacle slaps, and I like to wait for him to do the laser beam, flame dash behind him, and then quickly do the combo. While with Searing Exarch, you can just simply run a circle the whole time. He will simply just try to run after you and auto you. Once you've waited a few seconds for the damage reduction to fall off, we're going to do our combo. While you're running, and even if you have enough damage to instantly kill the boss as soon as it spawns, you'll be pressing Phase Run. Phase Run is going to keep Arcane Surge up the whole time. As soon as we're ready to do our combo, we are going to hit Hatred, then Zealotry, then Skitterbots. It's very important that we hit Hatred first, because Hatred will cost mana rather than reserve something, because we have it on Divine Blessing. This will set our mana to almost nothing, but we can still reserve without needing to have the actual mana for it. We have 11 seconds before Hatred falls off. That is the total time we have to do our combo. But what we would do is we press Hatred, Wrath, Skitterbots. Then we hit our Bottled Faith to put the consecrated ground next to the boss. Ideally, we want to be very close so the Wave of Conviction can immediately hit the boss. And then we press all of our flasks. It is a very easy combo to do if you practice it a few times. And what I would recommend that you should do is just come to Blood Aqueduct and practice it a few times. So just 3 auras, Bottled Faith, every other flask. You don't necessarily need to do it very fast, but you do want to do it before the boss hits you with anything. With enough practice, you can do this in less than half a second, which in some cases can even look instantaneous. Give it a few practices in Blood Aqueducts. You lose absolutely nothing for testing. And once you feel comfortable with it, give it a go on some of the easier invitations. You can either go try it on Space Mommy, or you can go try it on the mini boss for Eater of Worlds, as those invitations only cost 10 chaos each. You're not really losing anything while getting some firsthand experience and practice with doing the combo. For a quick little short detour, let's talk about the Atlas tree you would want for farming, either Uber Searing Exarch or Uber Eater Worlds. Obviously, you need the keystone for either of them, depending on what you want to farm. We also want Height of Hubris. Not having Height of Hubris makes us lose quite a lot of money per kill, simply because the more quants that we have on the invitations increases our likelihood of getting Eldritch Currency. That Eldritch currency actually helps us get quite a lot of our money back from the kills that we don't get a Omni or an Ashes. The only other thing that you need for your tree anywhere is martial forces. This makes Eldritch bosses have a 20% chance to drop a Conqueror map, and this actually helps us recoup a bit of our money as well. You can keep the rest of the tree however you like. You simply just need to branch to whatever boss you want to farm, get martial forces, and get Height of Hubris. As another little small piece of recouping some of the money for the kills that don't give you anything, you can also favor all of your maps as Crimson Temples. This will give the Conqueror maps that you sometimes will get from killing the bosses a very high likelihood of being a Crimson Temple Conqueror map, which at the time of this go for around 70 to 80 chaos each. The final thing to go over is the map mods that you will roll on your invitations. If you are doing Searing Exarch, you can do all of the attack, cast speed, and movement speed rolls just fine. If you are doing Eater Worlds, do not, under any circumstance, have an attack speed roll on your Eater Worlds. Eater Worlds with attack speed and Height of Hubris is beyond impossible, and he will very likely kill you before you can even do your combo with his just normal tentacle slap attacks. For the rest of the mods, when you're rolling your invitation, I would say you should go for around 60% or higher. You can also vol your invitations if you're comfy with that, and just sell the bricks if it bricks into something you can't do. And the only bricks for this build is tank stats. We don't care about reflex. We don't care if the boss has insane crit chance or does insane damage conversion or any of that. We only care about the stats that makes the boss tankier. That's monster life, unique boss life, chance for spell suppress, elemental resistance, and to some extent, reduced effective curses and reduced effective auras. From all my testing of doing this with the super budget build, effective curses and effective auras doesn't reduce your damage by much, but spell suppress, elemental resistance, and life can be a bit difficult to do on a low budget. If you decide to invest around 50 to 60 Exalt into this build, you should be able to do all of the life rolls except for the insane ones, like 60-70% life with no problem, and you should still be able to one-shot him. And even if you don't necessarily one-shot him, you can quickly just use another portal and walk back in to kill the boss. Spell suppress is very difficult to deal with, as you essentially need to deal double the damage. I would say if you have a 50-60 exalted build, it should be very doable to one-shot through spell suppress. And elemental resistance is by far the hardest. If you get a really high elemental resistance roll, very difficult to kill the bosses through 60, 70, 80% elemental resistance. And I would simply just always re-roll those unless you're spending even more money into your builds, like 100 exalted plus. If any of those pair up as well, so if we see life suppress, if we see life reduce effective auras, and so on, I would say it might be a bit too difficult to actually be able to one-shot the boss like that, and I would consider re-rolling those for something else. But once you've spent maybe a bit more money into this, you really shouldn't have to worry about the low rolls on at least life, but I would just use your judgment and think about it and do some trial and error to see what you can do. It's always okay to use multiple portals here. You don't need to necessarily one-shot the boss. You just need to make sure that the boss actually dies and you can pick up your loot. Speaking of being able to pick up the loot, you really don't want to make your bosses unkillable. Earlier, I mentioned you under no circumstance want to put attack speed on your Eater Worlds. This is what happens if you do put attack speed on your Eater Worlds. There we go. We got one.
What'd you get?
No, we got one as we... That was the last portal.
What?
That's all from me for today. I hope that you enjoyed this build guide. If you do want to try this build for yourself and have any questions, feel free to ask away in the comments, or feel free to come by my stream and ask them directly. I'll be playing this build for quite a while and farming some bosses with it if you'd like to see it in action yourself. And I would always love to have more people to hang out with. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. I appreciate you coming by and watching, and I'll see you next time.